Hello, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be telling you guys about the worst books that I read in 2020. Now, it should go without saying, but if I talk about any of your favorite books in this video, please do not take offense. These are books that just didn't work for me, and I'm using this video as a sort of form of catharsis, and also as a way to kind of tell people who have maybe similar reading taste to me about books that didn't, work for me and might not, as a result, work for them. So without further ado, let's get into the video, and I'm going to tell you guys about the 6 worst books that I read this year. So if you watched my best books of 2020 video, you guys know that thrillers were a new genre that I was discovering. And this is true, but sometimes in the process of digging for gems, you have to kind of wade through some shit. And this book was, in a word, shit. The story is about our frumpy heroine Louise, who is really unsatisfied with her life. She's recently gone through divorce and she's looking for a way to kind of spice things up. So in her quest to do this, she ends up sleeping with a guy that she met at a bar, and she quickly comes to realize that this guy is actually her boss, and her boss is actually married. And when she kind of discovers all of this, instead of doing the right thing, Louise decides instead to befriend her slam piece's wife. And in doing so, she kind of strikes up this friendship with the wife and finds out more about the relationship between the two of them, and finds out maybe that the guy that she's sleeping with is maybe not the good guy that she thought that he was. Now, I don't want to get into the spoilers for this book because number 1, the plot was just kind of convoluted, and 2, honestly, why bother? But let's just say the main twist in this book is a supernatural twist that really came out of nowhere. And in my opinion, most supernatural twists just don't really have a good place in thrillers. Usually, the supernatural element is not woven in with the plot as the story continues. It's something that's thrown in kind of as a cheap trick at the very end of the story to kind of justify the lack of plot and the lack of care that the author has taken in writing the story. Honestly, this sort of plot twist is just lazy, and anytime I read it in thrillers now, I am instantly brought back to reading this book and how much I really, really disliked it. And honestly, anytime I think about this book, it kind of has me incensed. So I'm glad that I got to talk to you guys about it and that I never have to think about it ever again. Now, the second book on this list is one that I just personally felt like didn't need to be written, and I know that that sounds sort of harsh, but I know that anyone who wants to pick up this book probably already has, so I'm not really dissuading anyone from picking it up, but that is Wayward Sun by Rainbow Rowell. Honestly, this book just wasn't good, and it wasn't even the fan service that I think people really thought this book would be. This book is really just about Baz and Simon as they trek across the US on sort of a road trip that doesn't really make sense or have any justification, and we also get these side plots from characters who we've met in the first book who, I don't know, none of their stories really culminated into anything super impressive. Honestly, I think my main issue with this book is that nothing that made the first book interesting was present in this second book. The subversion of the kind of chosen one trope that occurs in the first book doesn't really get carried on in a meaningful way in the second book. I think that there was sort of an attempt to show what happens after, the end, and show what sorts of trauma the characters deal with after they go through things like this, but nothing really happened, and we don't actually get the characters working through their trauma. We just have Simon being kind of sad this entire time, and Baz wondering if Simon is going to break up with him. It wasn't satisfying in any way, and the end of this book, the sort of big plot thing that happens, it didn't feel like it had any build-up, it didn't feel like it had any meaning, and it's not something that I think is going to affect the third book in this series. This book was just setup, but there was really no setup being done. And even if I were able to overlook the lack of character growth that occurs in the book, again, none of the things that happened in the plot were interesting. It's like, oh my god, look, we're going to the Cheesecake Factory. I don't care about you seeing US oddities. I care about things happening in the plot that actually make sense and are going to have an effect on my characters. None of that happened. Everything felt disjointed. It did not work. Anyway, it didn't work for me. I don't plan on carrying on with the series, and yeah, I kind of regret reading this book. So these next 2 books I'm going to talk about kind of in tandem because I disliked them for very similar reasons, and I also don't want to go into too much of the plot details because I ended up DNFing one of these books, but I think I discovered a lot about my reading taste this year, and these books are really proof of that. So the books that I'm talking about are Fear Me by B.B. Reed and Untouchable by Sam Mariano, the latter of which I ended up DNFing. So really what I learned about my reading taste is that I apparently have limits too. And that limit is apparently disgusting bully romances that are absolutely despicable, where the hero uses the heroine as a plaything and the heroine has absolutely no backbone. This is definitely a subgenre within bully romance that I think some people really, really enjoy and really appeals to them, but it's something that I just personally don't like. And you might say, Chandler, what is the difference between this and something like Punk 57 by Penelope Douglas? In my opinion, the heroine has agency in that book. She has autonomy. She gets to kind of decide what happens to her, and she fights back against the bullying that happens. In these books, neither of the heroines have any sort of agency or honestly personality, and they are just put into these horrible situations, and I think we're supposed to understand that the hero is some broken guy and that the ends justify the means, but that just was not the case. Neither of these books was good in any way. I really, really could not even finish Untouchable because it was disgusting to read about, and I'm sorry, but I can't forgive a hero who assaults a heroine. It's just not something I want to read about. about. And while I tend to have a really open mind about the romance genre, there's some things that even I can't personally stomach, so these two bully romances are things that I would not recommend to anyone and were just really, really bad. So the next book on this list is He Started It by Samantha Downing, and this book put me in another sexy little rage. I almost disliked this one more than Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough, mostly because this book was so promising. I think a lot more people hyped this one up for me. It was kind of a new release, and so the only things that I had heard were good things. And honestly, reading about half of this book, I was super intrigued by the plot and was excited to see where things would go. But by the end, I was just really upset. I felt like I had wasted all my time, and the ending was just so anticlimactic. It's honestly almost wrong to call it anticlimactic because a lot of things did happen, but I felt like a lot of it was out of nowhere, and the twists that happened were stuff that I could not ever foresee happening in real life. So the story is about a trio of kids as they embark to recreate this road trip that they went on with their grandfather a few years ago, and they go on this road trip because this is the way that they are going to earn their inheritance left to them by their now deceased grandfather. So the kids come together for this road trip, bringing their respective partners, their respective baggage, and all of the drama that ensues when you have your family together for a long period of time. And as the story goes on, you sort of figure out some of the family secrets and some of the drama that has been hidden over the years. And honestly, I was super into that plot. I thought that was a super intriguing way to tell a story, but ultimately nothing really mattered that was revealed as the story carried on. You're set up to believe that certain things are going to end up mattering, but at the 75% mark of the story, you find out that none of what you have kind of been led to believe matters at all, and that the characters with the most obvious motivations are actually the ones who did it, and that you could just easily get away with murder and there's absolutely no consequence to it. At the end of the day, this was just another thriller that felt ultimately kind of predictable and kind of lazy. I didn't like the writing, and while I liked the first book that Samantha Downing wrote, I was able to kind of suspend my disbelief because we had this badass heroine. This story just didn't work. I didn't like where things went, and I didn't like the open ending ultimately to the story. So this just kind of sucked, and while I don't feel this way very often, this is a book that I kind of regret listening to and regret spending the time reading. And then lastly, I think we all know what I'm going to say because I just talked about this book in my Goodreads Choice Words video. That book is In 5 Years by Rebecca Searle. I hated the hell out of this bait and switch bullshit. I think this is probably going to be one of the most controversial picks on this list because I know a lot of people from the comments of that Goodreads video really did enjoy this book, and I think the reason they enjoyed it is because to them it didn't feel like a romance, or they didn't go in expecting a romance, but I did, and I was ultimately really unsatisfied with this book as a result. I think my main issue with this book is that it does seek to kind of catch you off guard, and honestly, I felt that plot device or that sort of choice by the author felt kind of disrespectful to the reader. The story is set up to be this sort of what-if scenario where our heroine wakes up from a dream after getting engaged, and in this dream, or in this alternate reality that she ends up waking up into, she is engaged to a different guy, she has a completely different life, and then she wakes up back in the present again, and she's like, okay, what the hell was that? Am I living the right life? What am I supposed to do from here? And you're kind of led to believe that she is going to end up with this different guy. You're rooting for her to get with this different guy the entire story, but that is not really what the story is about. Honestly, I think with the kind of setup that this book has, you go in with certain expectations, and none of those expectations are really met because she doesn't end up going on a journey. This story is really about someone else's journey, and the 5 years that we saw in the future were actually a result of some terrible circumstances, and it just, again, it felt cheap. I know I've been saying that a lot, but a lot of the things that have been happening in these books that I've been reading have just felt cheap, disingenuous, and a way for authors to try to get one over on the reader in a way that makes you feel like, okay, well, why did I spend all of this time reading when you were just going to pull something out of left field? It just feels lazy. I want a book that is going to kind of lead me to the point and get me there in a way that makes sense. This book was like, hey, you thought this was going to be romantic? Just kidding. Life sucks. And that didn't work for me. And I think the worst part of all of this really was that at the end of the day, no matter what happened to our heroine, nothing really seemed to change her. She was ultimately the same person at the end of the day after all of the shit that had happened to her, and it just, what was the point of the story? Honestly, I'm done talking about this book. I've talked about it too much in this video and in other videos, but I really, really hated it, and as beautiful as it is, I'm so excited to unhaul this. So that is it. Those are all of the books that I really didn't like this year. In the comments down below, let me know what books you didn't like. Also, let me know if any of the books that I talked about were books that you also didn't like. I'd love to hear from you, get some of that sort of like cathartic feedback. But anyway, love you guys so much. Thank you so much for watching, and until next Sunday.